2. Love of God and love of one's neighbour. How does this radical insistence on the renunciation of people correspond to the commandment to love one's neighbour? Is this flight from people not a flight from Christ himself, who said, "Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself"? Does this self-isolation not lead to a loss or an absence of love for people? To selfish indifference towards anyone except oneself? Isaac would reply in the negative. On the contrary, he says, flight from people paradoxically leads to an increased love. The commandment to love God is universal, and it embraces the commandment to love one's neighbour. The commandment which says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, more than the world, nature, and all that pertains thereof, is fulfilled when you patiently endure in your stillness." In the commandment that speaks of the love of neighbour is included within the former. Do you wish to acquire in your soul the love of your neighbour according to the commandment of the gospel? Separate yourself from him, and then the heat and flame of love for him will burn in you, and you will rejoice at the sight of his countenance as though you beheld an angel of light. And do you wish that those who love you should thirst for you? See their faces on fixed days only. Truly experience is the teacher of all. We should emphasize here, for the sake of readers who find this attitude towards other people shocking, that Isaac was not giving recommendations which would be universally applicable. His writings are addressed primarily to solitaries, and he is usually talking to a very specific readership. Moreover, he speaks only of his own experience as a solitary by vocation, and of the experience of other solitaries, those around him and those of a past age. At issue is the specifically monastic way of learning to love people by giving up all encounters with them. Isaac is convinced that the main task of a Christian is the purification of his inner person. This is more important than contact with people or any activity on their behalf. Such activity is especially dangerous when the soul of a monk is not yet purified. There were many people, Isaac says, who were known for their deeds of philanthropy, but because they dwelt constantly in the world with its passions and temptations, they failed to make sufficient care for their own souls. Many persons have accomplished mighty deeds, raised the dead, toiled for the conversion of the erring, and wrought great wonders, and by their hands they have led many to the knowledge of God. Yet after doing these things, these same people who quickened others fell into vile and abominable passions and killed themselves, becoming a stumbling block for many once their actions were manifest. For they were still sickly in soul, and instead of caring for their soul's health, they cast themselves into the sea of this world in order to heal the souls of the others. But being yet in ill health, in the manner I have stated, they lost their souls and fell away from their hope in God. The infirmity of their senses was not able to confront or resist the flame of things which customarily drive the vehemence of the passions wild. Isaac does not reject good deeds. He simply points to the necessity of being spiritually healthy before going into the world to heal others. One can bring more profit to others when one is spiritually strong and has acquired experience of the inner life. External activity is no substitute for inner depth, not even an apostolic activity, which is indeed very useful to others. It is an excellent thing to teach men what is good, and by constant care to draw them away from delusion and into the knowledge of life. This is the path of Christ and the apostles, and it is very lofty. But if a man perceives within himself that by such a way of life and continual communion with men his conscience is being weakened, by seeking external things his serenity is being disturbed, and his knowledge is being darkened, and that while he seeks to heal others he is losing his own health, and departing from the chaste freedom of his will, his intellect is being shaken, then let him turn back, lest he hear from the Lord the words of the proverb, "Physician, heal thyself." Let him condemn himself. Let him watch over his own good health. Instead of audible word, let his excellent manner of life serve as an education, and instead of the sounds of his mouth, let his deeds teach others. And when he keeps his soul healthy, let him profit others and heal them by his own good health. For when he is far from men, he can benefit them even more by the zeal of his good works than by his words, since he is himself sickly and in greater need than they of healing. For if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. The solitary, according to Isaac, must first heal his own soul, and only then care for the soul of others. Inner life in God is more important than any philanthropic and missionary activity. Love the idleness of stillness above providing for the world's starving, and the conversion of a multitude of heathen to the worship of God. It is better for you to free yourself from the shackle of sin than to free slaves from their slavery. It is better for you to make peace with your own soul than by teaching to bring peace among men at variance. For as Gregory the theologian says, it is a good thing to speak concerning the things of God for God's sake, but it is better for a man to make himself pure for God. It is more profitable for you to attend to the raising up unto the activity of intuitions concerning God, the deadness of your soul due to the passions, than it is resurrecting the dead. This does not mean that Isaac disapproved the works of charity in general. He simply emphasized that these works are not the hermit's primary task. They are more appropriating for laymen. Christians in the world should do charitable work. The hermit's first task is to look after their own inner thoughts and purify their intellect. For the fulfilling of the duty of love with respect to providing for physical well-being is the work of those in the world, or even of monks, but only those who are imperfect, who do not dwell in stillness, or who combine stillness with brotherly concord and continually come and go. For such men this is good and worthy of admiration. Those, however, who have chosen to withdraw from the world in body and in mind should not serve in the husbandry of physical things and visible righteousness. Rather, by mortification of their members which are upon the earth, after the apostolic utterance, they should offer God the pure and blameless sacrifice of their thoughts, the first fruits of their husbandry, and also the affliction of their bodies by their patient endurance of perils for their future hope. For the monastic discipline rivals that of the angels. It is not right for us to abandon this celestial husbandry and to cleave to material things. Speaking outside the context of the eremitical life, Isaac emphasizes the necessity of good deeds done for the sake of one's neighbor. He objects to the words of a certain monk who says that monks are not obliged to give alms. Only that monk, Isaac says, it is not obliged to do so, who possesses nothing upon the earth, who earns nothing for himself among material things, who is in his mind clings to nothing visible, and does not endeavor to acquire anything. Cenobitic monks are not released from the necessity of giving alms and performing acts of philanthropy for their neighbors. As for hermits, they cannot give alms, but they must have mercy, which should be revealed not so much in good deeds as in prayer, which takes in the whole world. At the same time, deeds cannot be avoided, especially if the situation requires immediate action for the sake of someone who is suffering. Even hermits, whose task is not to perform good deeds, should act as deliverers and defenders of people in some situations. In general, they should strive to obtain love of their neighbors as an inner quality, to acquire a universal, merciful love towards every human being and every creature. Through being merciful, they may heal their own souls. Isaac says, making an important addendum to his own opinion, that good deeds should not be performed before one's soul is healed. While good deeds cannot heal the soul of the person doing them, the inner mercy does heal his soul. Let the scale of mercy always be preponderant within you, until you perceive in yourself that mercy which God has for the world. Let this our state become a mirror wherein we may see in ourselves that likeness and true image which naturally belongs to the divine essence. By these things and their like we may enlighten so as to be moved towards God with a limpid intellect. A harsh and merciless heart will never be purified. A merciful man is the physician of his own soul, for as with a violent wind he drives the darkness of passions out of his inner self. This universal love about which Isaac speaks cannot be obtained by deeds of philanthropy or in general by human effort. It is a gift which is received directly from God. St. Isaac's teachings on how the love of neighbor is acquired can be outlined as follows. 1. A person withdraws himself from his neighbor for the sake of life in solitude and stillness. 2. Through this he acquires an ardent love of God. 3. This love gives birth in him to a luminous love, haba sapya, of humanity. This term is borrowed from Isaac from the Macarian homilies, John the Solitary, and other Syrian writers. The theme of luminous love is developed by Isaac in chapter 10 of part 2. A person who has stillness and converse of knowledge will easily and quickly arrive at the love of God, and with the love of God he will draw close to perfect love of fellow human beings. No one has ever been able to draw close to this luminous love of humanity without having first been held worthy of the wonderful and inebriating love of God. The scheme offered by Isaac is therefore different from the one we find in the first epistle of John. He that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? According to Isaac, one should first love God whom he does not see, and by means of this love draw near to the love of his neighbour whom he sees. Or in this case, whom he also does not see, because he has deliberately withdrawn from seeing him. To acquire the love of one's neighbour by means of good deeds is as impossible as acquiring the love of God by means of the love of neighbour. To come from the toil and struggle with the thoughts to the luminous love of humanity, and from this to be raised up to the love of God, is a course impossible for someone to complete in this life, right up to the time he departs from the world, however hard he struggles. On the basis of the commandments and by discernment, it is possible for someone to control his thoughts and to purify his sensibilities with respect to others, and he can even perform good towards them. But for him to attain to a luminous love of humanity by means of a struggle, I am not persuaded to admit as possible. There is no one who has attained this, and no one who will attain it, by this path in life, and without inebriation in God, no one by the natural course of events will obtain the virtue that does not belong to him, nor will it remain in him serenely and without compulsion. At issue here is a special and the highest form of love of one's neighbour, which St. Isaac calls luminous and perfect, and which is a gift from God. It does not belong to human nature, and is therefore not a natural love of human beings, domestic animals, birds, wild animals, and so on, which we encounter in some people. It is a supernatural love which is born from inebriation in the love of God. The luminous love of neighbour is that sacrificial love which makes one like God, who loves sinners and righteous equally. In the case of the person who has been deemed worthy to taste of divine love, haba alehaya, that person customarily forgets everything else by reason of its sweetness, for it is something at whose taste all visible things seem despicable. Such a person's soul gladly draws near to a luminous love of humanity, without distinguishing between sinners and righteousness. He is never overcome by the weakness to be found in people. He is just as the blessed apostles were as well, people who in the midst of all the bad things they endured from the others were nonetheless utterly incapable of hating them, or of being fed up with someone showing love for them. This was manifest in actual deed, for after all other things they accepted even death, so that these people might be retrieved. These were men who only a little bit earlier had begged Christ that fire might descend from heaven upon the Samaritans, just because they had not received them into their village. But once they had received the gift and tasted the love of God, they were made perfect in love even for wicked men, enduring all kinds of evils in order to retrieve them. They could not possibly hate them. So you see that perfect love of fellow human beings cannot be found just as a result of keeping the commandments. Taking the Gospel's teaching about the two greatest commandments at his base, therefore Isaac offers his own interpretation. He sets out his own path for attaining to the love of God and neighbour. But this path is not for the majority of people who live in the world. It is only for those who have chosen solitude as a way of life, who have renounced the world, and who draw near to God by means of life in stillness. Living far from people and remaining internally alone, one can and must show love to others. Rejoice with the joyous and weep with those who weep, for this is the sign of limpid purity. Suffer with those who are ill and mourn with sinners. With those who repent, rejoice. Be every man's friend, but in your mind remain alone. Be a partaker of the sufferings of all men, but keep your body distant from all. Rebuke no one, revile no one, not even men who live very wickedly. Spread your cloak over the man who is falling, and cover him. And if you cannot take upon yourself his sin and receive his chastisement in his stead, then at least patiently suffer for his shame, and do not disgrace him. Know, brother, that the reason why we must remain within the door of our cell is to be ignorant of the wicked deeds of men, and thus seeing all as holy and good, we shall attain to purity of mind. The luminous love of neighbour is born from the heart that is purified, and the mind that dwells in stillness and is totally freed from worldly affairs.